Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event marking the release of a major new report on the future of the digital order. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. In 2019, CNAS launched a major center-wide initiative on countering high-tech illiberalism. It was clear at the time that the same digital technologies that connect people and enable a free exchange of ideas are now being used not only for greater repression in dictatorships, but also to polarize and to divide the politics of democratic societies. As a result, the same kinds of digital technologies once touted as a democratic panacea have been subverted by authoritarians to deepen their grip internally, to undermine basic human rights, to spread illiberal practices beyond their borders, and to erode public trust in open societies. Over the past 3 years, CNAS has examined this phenomenon in its many manifestations and pulled together work across multiple distinct lines of effort. We launched a digital freedom forum. We examined ways to blunt China's authoritarian toolkit, looked at how authoritarians are leveraging technology to their advantage, identified ways to use financial technologies, looked at the links between new technology and illiberal populism, and projected some of the future digital threats to healthy democracies. Today's report, The Future of the Digital Order, is the culmination of all of these efforts. It observes that a closed illiberal order is taking root in strategic regions around the world, and that US leadership and the cooperation of trusted, like-minded partners is necessary to turn the tide toward digital freedom. As the authors will discuss here, that involves new efforts across a broad spectrum of activity. Before I turn it over to the speakers, let me just offer special thanks to the members of the Digital Freedom Forum. This has been a bipartisan group of academic experts, industry leaders, and former government officials whose discussions helped to shape the report. The forum has been chaired by former Senator Kelly Ayotte, Secretary Jay Johnson, and Nicole Wong, former National Deputy Chief Technology Officer. Their insights and many others help guide our work throughout this process. Now let me turn it over to Megan Lamberth. Megan's the Associate Fellow on Technology and National Security at CNAS and a co-author of the report. And she is going to kick things off with a discussion with Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens of the University of Texas at Austin. So Megan, over to you. And Sheena, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks to everyone tuning in for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to welcome and encourage our audience to engage with us on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022 or by submitting comments and questions using the chat function on cnas.org/live. We'd love to hear your questions, and we'll be turning to them throughout today's discussion. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's fireside chat. Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. She's also the Jeane Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she's the award-winning author of Dictators and Their Secret Policy, Coercive Institutions and State Violence. Welcome, Sheena. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's terrific to be here.
I'd like to start with a sort of big picture question before diving more into the nitty-gritty. Analysts and commentators often put China at the forefront of the conversation on high-tech illiberalism. How comprehensive and how effective do you think China is at building an authoritarian model of technology? And how effective do you think China is at exporting that model?
Those are two great questions, and I'm actually glad you asked it as two separate questions because I think the answers to the first are somewhat different from the answers to the second. With respect to this first question, how effective China's been at building a model of high-tech authoritarianism, I think the answer is in a nutshell, very. We've seen huge investment on the part of the party state, both at the national and particularly at the provincial and subnational level. The technologies that are being procured and used are often cutting edge in terms of the global tech environment. And this has been clearly articulated as a key priority for the party state. You hear Xi Jinping talking about the need to develop what he calls this multidimensional information-based system of prevention and control. And that's articulated at a very high level as a leadership priority. So I think that's, that answer is China's put a lot of effort into it, and that effort has clearly paid off from the perspective of the party state and the party leadership. That doesn't mean the system's omniscient, and we can come back to this if you want to talk about some of this a little bit later. There are issues with data collection versus information integration, with human capital, with managing the bureaucratic politics of information as a resource and a source of power in the Chinese political system. But I think overall the answer is that China's built a system that is still in progress, but overall has become we're obviously world known, and we've seen no shortage of good reporting and examination of how that surveillance state functions in China. I think when we turn to this question of how effective China has been at exporting an authoritarian tech model, people's answers vary in part because we don't all mean the same thing when we talk about exporting or when we talk about a model. And I think it's important to remember that China is active, and Chinese tech companies are actively supplying surveillance technology that can be used to violate civil liberties, violate human rights, and facilitate violent repression in dozens of countries around the world. So my own research that looks at surveillance platforms, like safe city type platforms, finds these platforms showing up in 80 plus different countries as of a couple of years ago, maybe end of 2020 or so. But some of those countries are democracies that put really tight limits around how some of that technology can be employed and have protections built into the rule of law for civil liberties and things like that. So I think we need to think about sort of a three-part question when we look at China's export of some of these key technologies. What is the intent? That's not always clear. Is this sort of a coordinated plan by the party state to impose a Chinese style system in a variety of places? Or is this a group of Chinese companies that have exhausted the local procurement market and now need to find overseas clients to keep their business model going? The answers and the policy responses may differ depending on what we think that driver is. So we need to think about the intent and the key actors on the Chinese side. What are the actual activities they engage in abroad in both democracies and autocracies, and then figure out good ways of measuring the effects. And particularly on that last question, I don't think we have perfect data, but again, particularly when we're thinking about the activities and effects, we often need to be thinking about what are the domestic politics and the incentives of leaders in the recipient states, not just on the supplier side. And I think, as a final point, as we're thinking about a Chinese model, it's really important to remember that from the very beginning of the Communist Party's history, there's always been this sort of core governing principle that any theoretical model has to be flexible enough to adapt to local conditions. So I don't think we should ever set as our bar or think of it in terms of China trying to impose a system that looks exactly like China's in other countries. What it may be doing is illustrating and making available a set of tools and approaches with every expectation that whoever is going to use those tools on the recipient side will use them for their own purposes in their own way and adapt them to local context. Because that's what the Communist Party did, even in its own history, to accommodate the diversity of the different parts of China that they were trying to take control of. So that idea of adapting to local conditions is really hardwired into how the CCP thinks about governance. And for that reason, I think we have to be careful what we mean when we talk about exporting a model, because it just won't look the same in every place or produce the same results.
Thank you for that, Sheena. I wanted to go back to a point you'd made about coordination between entities within the Chinese model, because China is, as they say, not monolithic, obviously. How well coordinated is its push to harness technology for security, for public health, for monitoring and control?
So China's a big and complicated political system with a lot of different actors who are sometimes working in the same direction and occasionally are at cross purposes. And sometimes those two things are happening at the same time. And I think that's true of the surveillance and security system or set of actors as well. But one of the things that so for example, one of the things that we've seen that Premier Li Keqiang has talked about is the fact that China's collecting all this information, and yet it remains in what the party state has called governance information islands. The idea that different actors collect this information, but the party state hasn't been effective at integrating and merging different streams of data to actually use the full picture of the data they're collecting in governance. And so that from the perspective of the Chinese leadership is a problem, because they're investing in getting all this stuff and they aren't able to use it effectively. So what we've seen is a real push, particularly under Xi Jinping, to try to solve some of those problems. And at the national level, we paid a lot of attention in 2014 when Xi Jinping launched the National Security Commission, Central National Security Commission, which is a party body that works largely on domestic security. And one of the really interesting things we've seen in the last few years is that National Security Commission system has actually been replicated down through lower levels of the Chinese political system. One of its main functions is to coordinate different bureaucratic actors, coordinate sources of information, and try to resolve some of these problems of friction and fragmentation that exist at the lower level. So I don't, judging by what the Chinese political system says about itself, that's a work in progress. The work isn't done. There problems remain, but it's also very clear that it's something that the Chinese political system's aware of and actively trying to improve on, and that there's been some progress.
That is fascinating. Thank you, Sheena. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to touch some on how China has integrated various technologies in its pandemic response, because you've written a lot about how, and particularly during the pandemic, health and security have become intertwined in many ways in China. How have you seen the pandemic changing the use of technology for surveillance and monitoring in China? And are these changes likely permanent in your mind? And are more countries following suit?
Yeah, so one of the real ways that that the pandemic has strengthened surveillance and the use of digital monitoring technology in China is just simply to expand it to the realm of public health. And public health had a very sort of expansive application. A lot of the power to conduct surveillance and use the information from surveillance and governance was already available to the domestic security apparatus, the Ministry of Public Security, the sort of frontline street level actors that the public security apparatus works with, the neighborhood level, neighborhood committees and things of that type. And so the party state, when the pandemic emerged in China, had already put as a goal that it wanted to strengthen this, local level use of surveillance and eliminate gaps, improve coordination. And the pandemic provided both a response, a sort of forcing mechanism to solve some of these information islands problems, right? Now you have an emergency, you have something really urgent, you can push bureaucratic actors to do things faster from the top. But you also have a whole new domain and set of tools that can be developed. So some of the use of biometric technology, temperature checks, residence checks, monitoring people's movements at the building level, I think were pushed forward. And some of that work was really consolidated by the pandemic. So you had both an expansion and a consolidation of the surveillance apparatus as a result of the pandemic. Again, that's not to say any of this is perfect and works seamlessly, but I think that overall has been the direction of change, has been to really tighten and make the surveillance apparatus both more effective and able to cover more realms of human activity.
Thank you, Sheena. I guess with all of that in mind, thinking about U.S. government responses, the U.S. government has focused on both the national security and human rights concerns that China presents. How is this blending perceived in China? And in the mid to long term, how do you see leadership in China responding to the American push against digital authoritarianism?
That's a great question. One of the things that's been most interesting to me about the Biden administration's approach and the reaction that it's produced in China is that there has been this really strong emphasis on democracy and the link between democracy and national security for really understandable and important reasons. But one of the things that we've seen in China is that the US has adopted that framework at a time when China has expressed real security concern verging into paranoia about what it calls ideological security, right? Remember that national security is at its core a political security concept. It's about preserving China's socialist system, the leadership of the CCP Central Committee, with Xi Jinping at the core. So it's very much about regime security, and the way that Xi Jinping and the party state apparatus have sort of talked about what threatens party and regime security is not just physical or military power, but actually ideology and concern about ideological infiltration, corruption weakening people's loyalty to the Communist Party. And so one of the things that we've seen is that things that in the United States we think of as being framed defensively, right? Protecting and defending democracy have a tendency to be interpreted or sort of viewed in China with not only with great suspicion, but actually as an attempt to offensively destabilize or undermine the Chinese political system. And so that makes them much more of a core threat. And so looking, my focus is really on how China interprets and reacts to American policy. And I think what we've seen is from the Chinese side that some of this framing has really interacted with the way Xi Jinping has defined security to intensify the sort of paranoia and security, ideological and party security concerns on the part of the Chinese leadership. And I think that's been a factor in the intensifying competition over systems, what China sometimes calls systems competition.
Thank you, Sheena. This is a bit of a broad question, but looking ahead, how do you see China continuing to advance its technological ambitions into the future?
I think we'll see a continued emphasis on trying to consolidate and make effective the use of surveillance and technology for domestic security purposes, simply because that idea of regime security is so central to the aims and ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party. It is the core of their national security concept. So I think we'll see continued focus on and investment in technologies that facilitate that. I also think, Xi Jinping has talked about, and the party leadership has talked about, the issues that China has with human capital. So I think we'll see real efforts to recruit and secondarily to develop tech and AI talent. And that's something that obviously has real policy implications for S&T research in the United States, for American policy toward research funding, the private tech sector, and a whole range of issues that I think the report does a really great job of covering and unpacking. And then I think, we'll see continued effort to push the boundaries of tech research and innovation in specific areas that the party state has identified as core to its long-term interests. And the report goes through some of those, so I'll kind of kick that question to the report authors. But those are the basic areas and the strategy that I would expect to see.
Well, before we could get to the report authors, I'd love to hear your reactions to some of the conclusions and recommendations that were put forth in the report. Where do they align or diverge with your own views? And what are you most concerned by?
So I think that, I think, first of all, there's a really long list of recommendations, and I wish I had time to go through and reflect on any number of them individually. Overall, I think it's a terrific set of recommendations. There are some really important pieces here, and if you want to follow up on specifics, I can definitely do that. But, my sense when I was reading this was much less to quibble with the recommendations that the author made and just say, we need a sense of urgency. We need to get past the work with partners to develop a vision stage. The time for that was about 5 years ago. China has developed its vision and has both internally coordinated it and coordinated which international bodies and which international actors it's going to work with to try to actually start executing that vision in a set of domestic policies and its foreign and security policies. And my main reaction was, this is great, but we needed to be doing this 5 years ago. So how do we get the right sense of urgency on the execution and the implementation of the recommendations? Because it feels like we've had a lot of these conversations, and yet somehow there's something about the implementation process where we're just moving really, slower than we should be for the pace of technological change and the speed with which China is implementing its own policies.
Thanks, Sheena. I'd love to chat separately about the report sometime because, I would love to get your feedback. But before we turn it over to the authors, I have one last question for you. also kind of broad, so feel free to take it wherever you would like. But in the national security and the policymaking communities, we talk a lot about how policy struggles to keep pace with just the sheer speed of technological change. In your perspective, what kinds of technology policy issues are not getting sufficient attention within Congress or within the federal government?
So I think there's an issue with how we train policymakers to learn about technology on the job, because the reality is that whatever we learn, so I sit at the University of Texas at Austin. We have some great folks working in science and technology across the university doing great research. Whatever our students learn about that research from a policy standpoint when they're here, the research is going to look very different in 5 or 10 years. And so there has to be I think a good way to figure out how to regularly update people's knowledge and get, feedback from the people who are doing the research, whether it's in private industry or an academic setting, so that policymakers their knowledge doesn't get out of date. And that's just a really hard question to figure out. How would we do that when the policy world moves as fast as it does? With its questions, and technology and innovation move as fast as they do on their, the pace of their work, figuring out how to keep people current on both, I think is a really, really difficult just sort of challenge for thinking about American policymaking. And I it's a question I'm really interested in, and I'd be interested in the report authors' sense of what we might do and how we train people to think about these questions and how to think about professionalization when the knowledge base advances as fast as it has been recently and will probably continue to do so in the future. That's just one piece, but it's something that I was reflecting on while I was reading the report, because many of the technologies we're considering today, might not have been even on the table when some of the key policymakers were doing their core professional training. So how do you get up to speed to be able to address these challenges as fast as we need to be able to do so? I think that's a really key question for us to think about.
Right. That is certainly a really critical piece of it. We're unfortunately almost out of time, but Sheena, I wanted to give you a chance to leave any parting thoughts that you might have for us before we turn things over to the panel.
No, it was a pleasure. I participated in a few of the Digital Freedom Forum conversations and learned a lot from that conversation. So it was absolutely a pleasure to be part of that process. And I'm just really looking forward to, some of the questions that are planned for the report authors. I don't want to steal their thunder or take away from the excellent work that they did here. And I'm just really excited that we're able to spotlight it. So, thanks for having me, and congrats to the team on a great report. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sheena. Well, it's my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Ainike Rikkonen, a research associate on the Technology and National Security team, who will be moderating just a fantastic panel of speakers. Ainike?
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today. My name is Ainike, and I'm a research associate on the CNAS Technology and National Security program. I'm really pleased to be hosting this panel and to introduce our speakers for the second half of this session. And again, as Megan mentioned, as you have questions, please do drop them in the chat box at cnas.org/live, or also feel free to send them on Twitter with the hashtag CNAS2022. So we are joined today by 3 co-authors of The Future of the Digital Order. I'm pleased to introduce them. These 3 absolutely brilliant people are Lisa Curtis, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS, Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS. And last but certainly not least, Kara Frederick, Research Fellow in the Center for Technology Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So Lisa, Andrea, and Kara, welcome, and thanks so much for being with us today. All right, I'll dive right in. The report covers a lot of ground geographically and thematically, and our co-authors here bring a wealth and variety of expertise. So as I read through the report, to me, the crux really seems to be that without democratic leadership, especially US leadership, there's a massive gap for authoritarians to fill to proliferate models of using technology. So this brings me to my first question. The report says, as autocratic governments and leaders in fragile democracies look to exert greater control over their populations and pursue inexpensive pathways towards digital development, they find Beijing's high-tech illiberalism an attractive model. And so given that the US is still working on its own democratic model, so there's a clear gap, are there examples around the world where countries can look for alternatives, or are all democracies really behind the curve on this? And Andrea, I'd like to start with you, unless other panelists have a sharp, immediate thought here.
Great, I can jump in. And thanks for having me. And I'm so excited to be here with both Lisa and Kara. So this is great. So I guess a couple quick points, but before I turn to the crux of your question, but I just want to note that it's not just China that other countries are looking to as a model in this realm. And that Russia, which is something that I spend a lot of time following, Russia also has its own model of a digital authoritarianism that is also attractive to other autocrats and would-be authoritarian leaders. So Russia's model, it's less technically sophisticated than China's, but in many ways it might be more attractive to some leaders. It's comprised really of a complex system of laws that governments can weaponize. Of course, they rely heavily on disinformation, and so in many ways it's easier to implement. And for especially those countries that are still, hoping to claim legitimacy by upholding the trappings of democracy, I think it's a less risky choice for many of them. The second point I want to make is, Russia and China are sharing best practices. And sometimes that's explicit. In some cases, it's more passive, kind of a model of diffusion where the two countries are really learning from each other, learning from the mistakes and the successes that they have in this domain. You could see, for example, that in the online sphere, Russia's beginning to look more like China and China adopting some of the Kremlin's disinformation tactics. But I guess the point of saying that is that these countries are learning from each other. And so it's really critical that liberal democracies are also learning from each other as well. And so to your point, Eineke, about where might we look? So I focus on Europe. And so I think it's clear to many that we need to really double down on our efforts to work with our European allies and partners on these issues. And I think the US-EU Trade and Technology Council is really an obvious venue for that to happen. We now have this forum where the United States and the European Union can learn from each other and work towards a more unified model that other countries could emulate in order to safeguard their own data governance system. So, even within the TTC, we have an entire working group that's focused on the misuse of technology, threatening security and human rights. So I think that relationship there is a really critical one. But again, the point is the authoritarians are collaborating, working together and coordinating. And so it's really incumbent upon the liberal democracies to be doing the same thing and to really double down on those efforts.
Excellent, Andrea. Thank you. That was very comprehensive and totally agreed on the point on collaboration. I have heard some experts note that the US needs to put its own digital house in order as well. I believe that was in the report. And so I'd like to turn to Kara. And so in your ideal world, what would the end state look like if the US did put its own digital house in order? And what are some of the greatest hurdles to getting there? And I'd also like to draw on an audience question here from Anne. And she asks, what is the wake-up call to get action? Oh, Kara, I think we might have some audio challenges here. All right, we will come right back to Kara. So Lisa, I'll direct the next question to you. So we seem to be at a pivot point where swing states could go one way or the other. Definitionally, I suppose that would make sense for swing states. But even democracies like India are turning to tools like internet shutdowns. What compels some countries to adopt high-tech illiberalism instead of more democratic models? Or are there things that are more compelling about democratic models, perhaps, that could nudge the choice the other way?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And I think, when you ask what is appealing about high-tech illiberalism and non-democratic models of implementing technology, I think sometimes the answer is simple. It's a desire to control the population or stifle dissent, which is certainly what we see in China. And so, the concern is as China's digital footprint is growing, as it exports some of this high-tech illiberalism, that this is going to proliferate. And so it is critical that democracies, like-minded countries, work together to set norms and standards, to pool their own resources together to offer alternatives to countries, so that there are alternative digital options for countries as they are developing their digital infrastructure. So it is important. You're right that we have seen it, more internet shutdowns in India over the last couple of years than in many other countries, particularly in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So that has been problematic. But what I would say is we see India more as a partner in trying to counter this high-tech illiberalism that we see coming mainly from China, but also, as Andrea mentioned, from Russia. And the Quad in particular, this is the US, India, Japan, Australia, quadrilateral security grouping, is working toward these ends. And it's significant that when they had the landmark Quad Summit last September and issued a very fulsome joint statement that, setting norms for digital development was very much a part of that joint statement. And they introduced the Quad principles on technology, design, development, governance, and use that will facilitate and guide responsible, open, high standards innovation. So certainly the Quad is coming around a common approach to the development and deployment of telecommunications technologies like 5G technology. They've discussed options for deploying open radio access networks, which would ensure vendor diversity and market-based solutions. So the Quad has actually become quite an important grouping for pushing back against high-tech liberalism. And so I think that's important to remember. And, in addition to pooling resources, providing financing incentives for infrastructure, digital infrastructure alternatives in the region, I think another thing that like-minded democracies can do is reinforce each other's public messaging on the risks of using technology from untrusted vendors from autocratic states. So I think, we see India more as a partner in countering high-tech liberalism. I don't think any country has it perfect when you're talking about balancing, data protection with ensuring free flow of data. And certainly there are some issues in India, but when it comes to working through the Quad and trying to assert global standards and norms, I think India is seen as a partner.
It's excellent news all around. All right, Kara, if we're all sounding good, I'll come back to you with this question on what should the end state look like if the United States needs to put its own digital house in order, and what are some of the greatest hurdles to getting there? And second part of the question coming from Anne in the audience, what is the wake-up call?
All right, we'll try again. Am I good to go?
You're good.
All right, sorry about that. My tech is like 100 years old, so don't hold it against me. I swear I know this stuff. So when it comes to what the wake-up call is, I think look around you. The wake-up call is what you see with your very own eyes today. And I think we need to understand that national data protection framework, something to institute and enshrine and codify data protections for Americans, so that when we are using these digital platforms, we know that our data is private and secure. We know how it's collected, how it's stored, how it's shared. That is baseline. That is absolutely what we need it's requisite. It's just sort of that very foundational thing that we don't yet have in the United States of America. And this is a bipartisan issue. The Cyber Solarium Commission came out with a recommendation to institute it to get that moving. We see a little bit of energy on the Hill when it comes to this, but have yet to see in years and years anything comprehensive that has been passed, that has been actually enacted, that protects Americans and our data. You know, we're living in a new world right now, and I don't think that, you know, data is necessarily the coin of the realm anymore. There's many other issues like algorithms and other things that I know that we'll talk about in the future of this segment. But I do think that we need to basically bring ourselves into the 21st century. That's generally the wake-up call. So some sort of national data protection framework, that is the first step in getting our house in order. And then I think we have a huge comparative advantage in America, and that is, you know, the ingenuity of the people who are working and flourishing within our economic system. So what we can do is we can take that and then we can lead in privacy. You know, we do have lots of largesse in organizations that are government funded, like DARPA, organizations that are non-governmental organizations but are connected research organizations to the government. But then in private industry, you know, we have the biggest heavyweights that have the earth has ever seen when it comes to technology. So they should be leading in privacy. They should be establishing commercial norms for privacy. And what that looks like is, I think, exploring options, researching options for privacy preserving and enhancing technologies, differential privacy, federated models of machine learning, different protocols like encrypted DNS that can help give the user more control, privacy preserving computation on sensitive private data, encryption. All of these things would go a long way, I think, in ensuring individual liberties, the freedom of somebody to work and act and move digitally in a way that's secure, that a lot of people are very concerned about, not just in America as well. So yeah, there's a la carte items that you can pick and choose from people in the EU. I think a lot of their data privacy protections are very interesting, not perfect for our system, but at the same time, people are doing things right in other nations, and we can sort of cherry pick from what we think would work for us. But that national data protection framework, absolutely baseline. And then let's lead in privacy, America. We're suffering a dereliction of duty in that regard. And I do think that's more low-hanging fruit than not.
Thank you, Kara. I'm feeling the challenge and both a little bit of optimism there, which I'm grateful for on this snowy Friday. Lisa, I'd like to come back to you. We've heard a little bit in this panel already about some of the partners the United States is working with. So the report makes recommendations for engagement with democratic partners, non-democratic partners, and also competitors. In your opinion, which is the trickiest group and why?
Well, I think all are challenging. And let me just sort of go through that. I did talk a lot about the importance of working with democracies. But, you know, as I alluded in my previous remarks, even democracies pursue these issues a bit differently. But I do think that there's so much that we can do as democracies. And I went through some of that already, working together to strengthen legal frameworks, working together on standard setting, pooling our resources to be able to offer trusted alternatives to other countries, public messaging on the importance of working with trusted vendors. So, you know, there is so much that we can do with democracies. When it comes to non-democratic partners, of course, they will find appeal in Chinese authoritarian technology, which helps them control their populations, stifle dissent. So that is going to be very tricky for the United States. And even, you know, some of the countries that we partner with, we're going to have major differences on this. So I think, you know, we have no choice. We have to continue to work, you know, with these countries, but also we can try to foster education at the local level, training, working with civil society to the extent that we can. If we're not getting traction with the governments, maybe we educate the civil society, train them to keep their own governments accountable. I think that's something we can certainly do. But also we have to protect our own companies and our own technology when operating in these countries. And we have provided very specific advice in our report that I'll just quickly go through. And one of those is to give explicit guidance to U.S. companies that are operating in non-democratic markets and prohibiting them from entering joint ventures with Chinese companies in areas that could have negative implications for digital freedom. Another thing we can do is establish non-compete regulations to prevent former cybersecurity experts that worked in our own government from then going and working for a foreign government. So, there are some things that we can do as we deal with non-democratic partners. And then, countering U.S. competitors, namely Russia and China, it's more export controls. What can we do on protecting technology? Using sanctions against bad actors. We have done this with Huawei, which has been fairly effective. So, there are different tools that we have. And I think that was the whole point of our project, was to show, we don't have the luxury of just working with our democratic partners to assert some of these policies. We have to find other ways, other tools to work, whether it's with non-democratic partners or against our competitors and countering what they're trying to do.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm hearing a lot about the numerous tools and the many, many stakeholders we need to draw into this fight as well. And on the note of competitors, Andrea, I'd like to turn to you, as I know you've written about this extensively. How do some of the synergies between China and Russia complicate the response of democracies as they look to combat the phenomenon of high-tech illiberalism? And when we think about synergies, what does that mean? Are they coordinating, or is that something else? And what are the ways that we should really be looking to disrupt some of those synergies?
Okay, great. Well, as I said in my earlier remarks, we have to distinguish between Russia's model of digital authoritarianism and that of China's. And I think it's clear that and we talked about how there is convergence between the two. So for instance, in 2014, or since 2014, really the Russian state has moved much more firmly in the direction of China. One really good example of that is Russia's move to establish a sovereign internet, which is much more like the Chinese model, which basically would allow Moscow to sever its internet from the global internet and allow them to, do more to control cross-border data flows. Like I said, we have also seen this moving in the other direction, where Beijing is adopting China is adopting Russia's disinformation tactics. Really good examples come from in the wake of in the early stages of the COVID crisis. We really saw China adopting much more aggressive disinformation campaigns. And that was a real shift from previous efforts to shape the information environment in ways that kind of talked about China's peaceful rise, to them using much more of the conspiracy theories and then flat out sowing disinformation around the pandemic. And I think we see a lot of evidence that now they're really echoing each other's points. And even in the Ukraine crisis, which is playing out right now, you can look in the kind of Chinese propaganda, and it very much echoes the Russian narratives of events. Good example from that, when the UK released intel on Russia's effort to topple the Ukrainian government, that was something that was kind of doubled down on in the Chinese media environment. And of course, around events in Kazakhstan, where Russia intervened through the CSTO to back up Tokayev and his authoritarian regime there, the Chinese government very much echoed and supported Russia's narrative of events there. So I think the broader point really is that Russian and Chinese views on emerging technologies and digital control have really aligned. They both view a free and open internet and the spread of digital technologies as a threat to their own national sovereignty. They see them as a threat to their own hold on power. They view these technologies and the internet as conduits for the United States to basically destabilize their regimes. And they see that link between citizens rising up to overthrow repressive regimes in the internet and the role that these ICTs play in that. So they're both then taking steps in lockstep, I think, to solidify their control over their populations internally. So there's a lot of kind of convergence between what we see. I think the synergy point is a really interesting one and something that I've been really fascinated with. I think we can see, China is clearly playing the leading role in the digital domain, but the complementarity between their interests and really in their efforts is producing some very interesting synergies. And we talk about those in the report. One, I think, is that they're actually making digital autocracy accessible for a broader swath of states. And I talked about that a little bit in my opening remarks, but basically now kind of onlooking countries have a grab bag of tactics from which they can choose. If they want to go the more overtly repressive route, China provides a lot of things there. Russia also, a little bit less overtly repressive, but nonetheless effective tactics if your goal is to repress your citizens. So it's this broader grab bag. I think it facilitates digital authoritarianism for a lot of these swing states. The other kind of interesting synergy that we highlight in the report is the way that the two countries are accelerating their digital innovation. We've really seen a significant increase in technology cooperation between Russia and China, and that includes in ways that I think could accelerate the development of their illiberal technologies. A good example there is one of Russia's leading developers in AI and facial recognition is called NTech Lab, and they jointly work together with a Chinese company to produce a wearable camera with a facial recognition function. And then finally, it's clear lots of people have talked about the way that, they're working together kind of in lockstep in international institutions to shape norms around the internet and other emerging technologies like IA in ways that kind of advance their own illiberal interests. So the synergies are real. I think the point is that it amplifies the effects of both. They're kind of in lockstep. They're singing from the same sheet of music. So we can't think about one or the other, but they're actually making each other more impactful and influential in this digital authoritarian space. And so finally, I'll just wrap with a couple of ideas. I think Kara is, obviously spot on, it starts at home, and we need a compelling model that can compete with what countries like Russia and China are doing. So resilience is key. We talked about there's so many different stakeholders. So there certainly is a role for liberal democracies where we can be doing more to disrupt. And Elisa was talking about things like export controls. That is one way to disrupt what they're doing. We can impose further sanctions on entities that are kind of facilitating human rights abuses. We can pass our own legislation that prevents Western companies or US companies from investing in companies that are building AI tools for repression. So there's a disruption angle. There's the resilience angle that Kara talked about that starts at home. And then in those swing states, I think the resilience piece is also really important. So we can work on, making these countries more resilient to digital influence campaigns. We can work to support healthy information ecosystems. And I think there's a whole host of things that we could be doing to really strengthen the political and legal frameworks that govern how surveillance technologies are used within these countries. And we can support civil society and other watchdog organizations that can call out government abuses. So I think there's definitely kind of opportunities in each of the types of states, Eineke, that you've talked about.
Thank you, Andrea. Certainly concerning with this sort of ready to go grab bag of tools. But luckily, Kara's written extensively on this in the defense of democracies as well. So in the Wall Street Journal, you had written about the rise of digital tools that can defend democracies and be used to counter authoritarian regimes and practices. And so a question for me is, which tools are you most excited about? And a question from our audience coming from Ryan Johnson. He notes that, the report notes an early misguided belief that the internet would inherently be a democratizing force. And he's curious to know your thoughts on Web3 and blockchain tech. If these are decentralizing forces, are you optimistic that this is true, and can it be used to undermine authoritarian influence?
Yeah, great questions. And really appreciated what Andrea said about the amplification of the success of some of the technology development that's going on between China and Russia. I hadn't heard that anywhere else, so I thought that was the most fascinating part of the report, and I think that needs to get out there more because people just don't really understand what that looks like. And yes, you can say that they're collaborating, but the way that Andrea wrote about it, yeah, everybody go read at least the Russia portion of the report, Lisa's portion too. But I thought that was fascinating. Great question, Ryan. I think that's so interesting as well because a CNAS adjunct just had a Washington Post report about Web3 and authoritarianism. So it sort of trends along the lines of what we've been doing at CNAS for the last couple of years. And I really am excited about a lot of these technologies. I would say, first and foremost, let 1,000 signals bloom, right? So the Signal Foundation really does care about privacy. They're not going to sell you a bag of goods like when, WhatsApp was integrated into Facebook. Look at it now, pretty much compromised. A lot of other, I would say, applications, same thing. So that privacy focused technology, I think that's really critical. And people who actually care about real norms and those individual freedoms and liberties, I think you invest yourself in places like that. Go to work for them. Let's work on these hard problems. Decentralized networks, you mentioned, huge in terms of, at the most basic level, we can talk about peer-to-peer networks, mesh networks, what Richard Fontaine and I wrote about in the Wall Street Journal. This helps circumvent that consolidated top-down control of the internet throttling. It allows people to organize, to talk to each other, to figure out how to protest, really not under the watchful eye of the government, or if they actually can't communicate using the centralized system, then it allows them to really redress that imbalance between the government and the user or the citizen itself. So I think those decentralized networks are critical. When it comes to crypto, I was dismayed to hear there's sort of machinations in the Biden administration right now about how they're going to severely regulate crypto for national security purposes. And I think we all sort of understand, yes, terrorist financing can happen when it's very difficult to have a chain of custody of these things. But at the same time, crypto, distributed ledgers, the underlying technology, blockchain, I think it's really useful for citizens, not just in America, but all over the world to use if they want to have some degree of freedom in their financial transactions, because what we've seen thus far is sort of a tightening of the noose around people with specific political viewpoints when their online financial transactions are being more and more subject to centralized authority and consolidated concentrations of power. And I don't think that's sort of the way to go at all. That's against the ethos of the United States of America, right? We're sovereign citizens. So I think it's very important to have those hedges against, let's say, inflation, vulnerabilities, hedges against vulnerabilities in the market. So, give the citizen their power back. And I think these technologies go a long way in doing so. So I don't like that those contours sort of emerging. We haven't, the devil's in the details, of course, but I think decentralized technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, peer-to-peer networks are huge when it comes to big concentrations of power visiting their will on individual human beings and citizens. And we need to hopefully mitigate some of those unintended consequences if certain governments move forward with these clampdowns.
Thank you, Kara. I have a follow-up question for you on a similar note. So many technologies are dual use. Many of them aren't inherently good or bad, but it does seem that certain ones may nudge governments one way or the other. Or, do I have this backwards, right? Can the technology not push the government, but is it really, coming just back down to what governance looks like and what certain governments want to do with their toolkits?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I was a huge proponent of, the first clause, right? Not inherently good, not inherently bad. But I've sort of rethought my position on the issue. And Yes, dual use matters clearly. Again, the internet, we thought it was about democratizing information. The reality looks quite different. That's a Richard Fontaine quote. So I think that we do need to look at technology, but also itself. But remember that human beings design technology. So you can imbue it with your values. So there's ways to write code that are, imbued with what you think is a priority and what you think is the most important. Again, there are ways to design products and dictate the design of products that conform to specific philosophies or the way that you see technology, aka that insertion of the privacy value in the design of a lot of these products. So I do think you can design technology and make it technically have a value judgment in that way. So my thinking just kind of, it's a little unpolished, but I think that's a sort of a way to think about the problem nowadays, now that what we've seen, especially over the course of the past 5 years, with China surging ahead, Russia again amplifying those gains too. So I think that's a sort of a different look at the problem. Authoritarians gonna authoritarian, they are going to use whatever they can to that was inartful, but they're going to use whatever they can to basically retain internal control. Sheena, brilliant, Dr. Greitens, she is she's put forward in common discourse right now that China does, they care a lot about their internal stability. That is at top of mind. That's what they want to accomplish first and foremost. Yes, they export their model, but it has material effects on China itself. So yes, they're making the world safe for autocracy, Jessica Jen Weiss, but at the same time, they care about what goes on in China. So if they're going to use whatever tools that they can to make sure that that China is made in Xi's image first and foremost. So yeah, in some, I don't think necessarily technology is just this sort of nebulous neutral thing floating in the ether that the bad guys or the good guys have to grab. I think we can be very deliberate in how we design technology going forward to make it easier for authoritarians or easier for people who think more like us and want a world that is more free and more open in general.
Thank you, Kara. The next question here comes from the audience, but coming from Alexander, and if Alexander doesn't mind, I might paraphrase it a little bit. So he asks, should we be worried about authoritarian governments throwing their weight around to exploit Web3's weaknesses and therein strengthen their surveillance states? But I think more broadly, this might point to the fact that so much of technology development and regulation and standard setting actually comes from outside of governments. And so my broad question to the panel then is, on the one hand, should we be worried about authoritarian governments using their weight to influence the shape of these emerging internet architectures? And also, how do you see the role of non-governmental institutions changing in terms of their importance and role? For instance, standard setting bodies or certain multilateral groupings or other areas where perhaps, that weren't arenas for geopolitical contest sort of coming to the fore. And please let me know if I should consolidate that question down. I'd be curious perhaps on the Quad or TTC, or Kara, if you want to go first.
Sorry. Yeah, I can hopefully offer something a little imaginative here, and the audience can rip me apart if they want. But I think there's a way to sort of get creative in this regard when you're talking about non-governmental organizations. When I was in Taiwan last in 2020 for the presidential election, it made me think of, they have a lot of dissidents who are now in the DPP, people who had taken part in Taiwan's Sunflower Movement, who are doing amazing things in the digital space. Audrey Tang is leading the way in this regard. She's a programmer. She does a really, really good job of crowdsourcing a lot of the problems of democracy and sort of bringing them to the fore of the government there. But then you look at the Hong Kong's umbrella movement as well. So what is to stop a non-governmental organization, even a government, if you want to go that far, from bringing these, dissidents together and helping them exchange technologies, exchange best practices? What's to stop somebody from sponsoring that? So giving these tools to dissidents, and so they can better thwart authoritarian mindsets that are at their doorstep. So I think there are ways to sort of think creatively that non-governmental organizations organizations can lead the way in doing. And I think that's sort of just one example. Bring them together for technology exchanges, show them how to use these technologies, and figure out a way to make cuts into the giant of the CCP, and also insulate yourself against imminent encroachment upon your freedoms by such entities.
Thank you, Kara. I want to give the last word. Lisa and Andrea, I'll wrap up after this question, but do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add before we close today?
I think we've hit some of them. Lisa, I'll jump in really quick. I mean, just to reiterate, so many things that Kara said there, but in terms of being worried about authoritarian shaping the rules of the road, I think we do have a lot to be concerned about. And we know that these actors have fundamentally different definitions of a lot of key themes. Russia, for example, has a fundamentally different definition of what cybersecurity means. And they're weaponizing some of these definitions in order to advance rules that then support their illiberal aims. And so we have a lot of work to do with our allies and partners in these standard setting bodies and in international institutions. Having US and allied leadership there is key. For a little while, the United States was a little bit absent from the UN and some of these important standard setting and other UN bodies that touch on all these issues. And so having leadership there, I think, is really critical in ensuring that that the rules of these technologies are going to support the kind of world that we all want to live in.
Yeah, and just coming back to the importance of working with our democratic partners and allies, we know countries like Japan are setting good examples, using technology in a way that prioritizes data privacy, individual liberty. They've been able to harness things like smart city technology, particularly in the wake of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, yet made sure participants had a choice. They opted in. They shared only data they wished to share. So countries like Japan have been talking about the importance of free flow of data, cross-border free flow of data for a long time. They've sort of led the way on this. So we need to work together with Japan, Australia, and other countries. And then again, we can work at the local level. We know USAID is working on training local NGOs on holding their governments accountable, not relying on untrusted vendors, understanding disinformation, and how to counter it. So I don't think we should discount the ability of our diplomats, of our aid workers overseas to be able to have an impact at that local level as well.
Excellent. We're slightly over time here. I would love to spend the entire afternoon with you all on this extremely important and serious, but nonetheless exciting subject. I want to thank you, Kara, Andrea, and Lisa, and also Sheena, Richard, and Megan for speaking on this topic today. And to our audience, thanks so much for spending a prime slice of your Friday afternoon with us. CNAS's research on countering high-tech illiberalism and digital freedom is continuing into 2022. So please stay tuned for more. Be sure to engage with us at CNAS-DC on Twitter or by signing up to the Tech Program's newsletter. I promise it's extremely cool. Stay warm this weekend. Have a happy Friday, and thanks so much for tuning in.